Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're so pleased you're here today. I'm Betsy Hatfield, Executive Director of Preservation Kentucky, and I'm delighted that you were able to join us for our webinar today, and thank you for attending. Today's webinar is the first of a series we're offering for May National Historic Preservation Month, and we'll continue offering throughout the year. Our webinar series is being made possible by a grant from Brown-Forman, and this grant also helped update our new website and expand the knowledge base and educational materials offered on our site. So I hope you'll take the time to visit it and utilize the publications and information there. www.preservationkentucky, all spelled out, .org. There's also a calendar on our site of upcoming webinars and events, and a page of other grant opportunities that we provide, including the Edith S. Bingham Education Grant, which helps students and preservation professionals attend workshops and conferences. We will upload today's webinar to our website, and we'll share the link with you all so that you can review it again. You may ask questions throughout the webinar by submitting them in the question section of your control panel. Be sure to send them to the organizer only so that Diana and I can see them. And we'll answer your questions immediately following Diana's presentation. Preservation Kentucky is the statewide partner of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so I'm excited to be launching our Preservation Month webinar series with Diana Maxwell, Grants Manager of the National Trust. I've been working with Diana for 3 years now, and she and others at the Trust have been a tremendous source of support and information for us. We're fortunate to have a Kentucky Fund, which was established in 2004 when the National Trust held their annual conference in Louisville, and it's been a helpful resource for a variety of projects with nonprofits and governments throughout the state. Diane is a native of Western New York. She grew up on a dairy farm that's been in her family for 5 generations. She has a bachelor's degree in communication from Cornell University and a master's degree in museum studies from George Washington University. And she's worked at the National Trust since 2009 and has managed the grants program since 2013. So if you'll join me in welcoming Diana from Washington, D.C., I'm going to turn the presentation over to her.
Great, thanks, Betsy. So hopefully we will get my slide up, I think. I think that looks good. Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about our grants program, both generally and also what we specifically can do in Kentucky, which is one of our more unique states and has some great extra kind of not a bonus fund, but does some things that we can't do in all of our programs. So just to start off, just wanted to show you. That's not working. Hang on. There we go. Maybe now. There we go. So who we are, if you've ever sent an email to our grants office or given us a call, you probably talked to either myself on the top or my colleague Jordan Torrance. His photos are on the bottom. We're located here in headquarters for the National Trust in Washington, D.C. in the Watergate office building. And that's our contact information on the screen, which you can also find on our website. And we are... That's what I look like, which I feel like is always nice to know what someone looks like when they're talking at you on a webinar. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the National Trust Forum program and why you need to know about it. The National Trust Preservation Fund, which is our largest grant program, some of our special funds, the application process, and then we'll at the end, as Betsy mentioned, we'll do a question and answer with any questions that you might have. So why Preservation Leadership Forum? Well, forum's the way to access grant funding. You have to be an organizational member of Preservation Leadership Forum to apply for a grant. It's a $250 a year membership, but it gives you some other benefits as well. It's a way to access resources, in-depth publications, discounts on trainings and conferences, and you can learn more about the opportunities for that through our forum communications. We have over 2,000 members, and it gives you networking opportunities and discounts on trainings in the conference as well. So it's not just a way to get into the grant program, but it is something that you need to do to be an applicant. So starting off, our National Trust Preservation Funds, we have over $1 million available annually nationwide, and the awards generally range from $2,500 to $5,000. They all require a one-to-one cash match, although this does not have to be in hand when you apply. We can only award to nonprofit and government agencies, so nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, and government agencies. And there's 3 deadlines a year. The next one coming up is June 1st. And these are all to fund the planning phases of preservation projects and educational activities. So our granting funds are made up of individual endowed funds that are geographically restricted, usually by state or sometimes by region. But we also have some that are programmatically restricted, like a battlefield fund or a modernism and recent past fund. So you can find more information about those grants on our website, but when you go to apply for a grant, you don't need to apply for a specific fund. You just apply to the National Trust Preservation Fund. And one of the nice things about Kentucky is that we do have multiple funds available in Kentucky. So for all of these funds, you apply through the regular Preservation Fund application. Most of these funds are limited to planning and education projects. We have one small fund that's limited to Mercer and Boyle counties, but we do have one fund that allows for physical preservation work. So beginning in June, we'll have about $30,000 available between the different funds to grant just to planning projects. Now this is a kind of a build-up from previous years, so we don't always have that large of an amount, but next year, if you're looking to do some planning for preservation projects, hire an architect, that sort of thing, I'd encourage you to come in for a grant. We'd love to see projects in Kentucky. And as I mentioned, we do have one fund that does allow for physical preservation work, so as we call it, brick and mortar work, and that's the Linda and Jerry Bruckheimer Preservation Fund for Kentucky. This is a new allowance that just started happening this year, so we're very excited about that because we've heard from Betsy and from other folks on the ground in Kentucky that this is really what's needed on the ground, is that physical money for physical preservation work. So in addition to funding planning projects and education projects, this fund can also fund restoration, rehab, stabilization, and preservation of historic sites and structures, and also work to preserve archaeological sites. So it's not just buildings, but sites as well. So we have, it can also be used, all of the projects can be used for planning and education work, as I said. So this is the type of thing such as getting consultants with expertise in areas like archaeology, architecture, planning, engineering, law, fundraising, media relations, education, sponsoring conferences and workshops, designing and implementing innovative preservation education programs, and designing, producing, and marketing printed materials or other media. So the Bruckheimer Fund is eligible for all of those things. The other Kentucky funds are basically eligible for all of those things minus any physical preservation work. So for the Bruckheimer Fund, we have about $13,000 available each year, and our grant funds tie into our fiscal year, which begins July 1st, so that means for the June Preservation Fund round is when we have our kind of new influx of money. So this first round in June will be, all of our funding will be available for this next coming year. So that's our largest grant program, the Preservation Fund. We also have some other programs as well. We have emergency and intervention funding that is awarded for emergency situations. This again is limited to nonprofit organizations and public agencies. The range is from $1,000 to $5,000, and no cash match is required for this because it is something that has come up. That's an emergency situation. We assume you may not have time to pull together that match and just need that immediate help. So we ask you, if you have an emergency situation, just contact us by email or give us a call. We can talk you through our project and see if we have funding available. The project on the screen was something we funded in Georgia in 2015. We gave a grant to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation to do stabilization and reconstruction design for historic Gaines Hall at Morris Brown College. They had, as you can see, had a pretty devastating fire. And so we, and they had some city officials that were calling for demolition, but local preservationists rallied around the building, which was once a lecture hall for W.E.B. Du Bois, and the mayor threw his support behind the preservation of the building as well. So this grant enabled the Georgia Trust to engage a structural engineer designed a bracing system to support the original exterior walls as well as a new interior. Those existing interiors were not salvageable in a roofing system. And so Gaines Hall is located just a few blocks from the new Atlanta Falcons Stadium, and the neighborhood's economic boom bodes well for adaptive reuse of this building, which is what we like to see. Even if there's a tragic event, that it can still move forward and be a great building in a neighborhood. So we have, as I mentioned, the National Trust Preservation Fund is our largest fund, and emergency funding is kind of tied in from that. We pull the money for the emergency fund from our regular funds. And then we also have a number of special funds, which some of them are only once per year, and some of them are rolling. One of them is rolling throughout the year. And this is a list of them, and I'm just going to talk a little bit more about these four funds you see on the screen. So the first is the Johanna Favreau Fund for Historic Preservation, and this provides grants up to $10,000 for planning and education. So one-to-one match. It's for nonprofits and government agencies, and there's one deadline each year that's early spring. Both this fund and the next one I'm going to talk about, the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund, have a longer lead time in terms of notification of when you've received the grant. So last year applications were due March 1st, and it was the same way this year, but applicants won't be notified until July 1st, and so that's going to probably continue for the next few years. We just we need a little bit longer time to make these decisions since they're made with a donor-advised jury. And you can always sign up for our email notifications on the grants website to get specific dates for when things are due. Most of our due dates stay the same year to year, but some do change a little bit. The project here from the Favreau Fund was in Baltimore. This is Notre Dame of Maryland University, and they received a Favreau Fund grant for $5,000 to hire a preservation consultant to create a preservation plan for the exterior of this building, Gibbons Hall, which was at that time 140 years old, and it housed the first Catholic college for women in the United States to award a 4-year degree. So the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund for Historic Interiors has a similar bent as the Favreau Fund, although it is focused, as you might be able to tell, on historic interiors. So again, planning and education grants, but they're limited to the interior of a historic building. They go up to $10,000, one-to-one match, nonprofits and government agencies, etc. Same deadline as the Favreau Fund. So again, that should be early spring next year. We're just in the process next week of making those grant decisions for this year. So this project was at Texas A&M University in 2013, and they got a $10,000 Mitchell Fund grant to prepare a preservation plan for the decorative painting treatments of Scots Hall, which you see there. And so another of our special funds is the Hart Family Fund for Small Towns. This again is limited to planning and education grants, and the key here is that they need to be in small towns, which are described as a population of less than 10,000, and these can grant up to $15,000 grants. Other same deadlines, and the deadline for this year was May 1st. So again, the deadline's passed for this year, but if you are from a small town and if the timing doesn't work, if the timing for this works out better than it would be for the Kentucky Fund, or you have friends in other states that you have great projects in small towns, this is a national fund, as are the Favreau and Mitchell funds. So we'd love to see projects come in next year for this. And this project on the screen is the City of Lakeport. The Hart Family Fund for Small Towns grant supported a feasibility study for the reuse of their Carnegie Library, which was built in 1918 and owned by the city, and it was in near original condition and had been well maintained, but just was vacant. So the community wanted to find a new and best use for the property and to be able to open it for the public. So that's what they did with their Hart Fund grant. The last kind of special fund I'll talk about is a little bit different. It's the Peter H. Brink Leadership Fund, and it's meant to be used for mentoring and peer-to-peer learning. So Peter Brink was a long-time National Trust employee, and when he retired, this fund was set up in honor of him and his strong belief in mentoring between preservation groups. So this fund it's a rolling fund, it's accepted throughout the year, and it reimburses travel costs and an honorarium for a mentor up to $2,500. So in this case on the screen, Esther Hall, who was chair of the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, traveled to Preserve Granbury in Granbury, Texas, to mentor that group in leadership training and strategic planning. So she led the executive board through a board development assessment checklist exercise and later provided training to the full board on the basics of boardmanship. So the group reviewed and updated their strategic plan for the coming year based on that information she gave them. So this is a good way to kind of have some internal opportunities for your organization to grow and to learn from another organization. So if you have an idea for one of those, email us, give us a call, and we're happy to walk you through the process for that. So those were a quick and dirty on a number of our grant funds that might be pertinent to your interests. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process that grants go through and what you kind of need to know. So how do you apply? You apply online. Everything is available online. You can go to this website, forum.savingplaces.org/funding. That's our main grants page where you can find information and guidelines on all of our programs. Generally, your application will need to include 3 letters of endorsement, your tax-exempt status, the resume of personnel administering the project, a list of your board, and a letter of consent from the property owner if you don't own the property. Our website on the screen will take you to our grant management page, which is run by an outside company who we love. They're great. And you'll need to sign up for a login and password there, which is different from your forum password or if you have a different National Trust membership password. So it's just a separate system. So it's something to be aware of if you're trying to log into something that is not letting you log in. You may just be not quite on the right page. So the application is typically live 2 months before a deadline, and then we try to notify applicants within 2 months after the deadline if they have been selected. So once the grants have come in, they go through a pretty similar review process no matter what the fund is. And generally it goes like this. So first they are checked in by grant staff for basic eligibility, making sure that they meet our guidelines and it's a project we can fund and that the organization is one we can fund to. And at that point we might follow up with you for clarification or any additional information we might need. The next step, they go out for review. So they're reviewed by grant staff, National Trust field or staff, or sometimes other staff, partner organizations, like that's the case in Kentucky, and in some other states as well. And then finally the decisions are made by a grants committee, which is sometimes made up of the grant staff and the vice president of field services, or a grant jury, which can be National Trust staff, original donors to the fund, they're still involved in some of the funds, or an external juror or a jury. Just depending on the fund, the group is made up can be made up of slightly different people, but the decision is made, and then the applicant is notified. And so this is typically within 8 weeks of the due date of the grant. We try to be pretty spot on with that. If it's on a weekend, we sometimes do it before, sometimes after, depending on when we've been able to have our decision meeting and get those decisions made, and occasionally it will take us a little bit longer, but we try to let you know about that ahead of time. We know people have projects that they're trying to get to in certain times, and inside of winter or before winter and things like that. So we try to notify you as close to the date that we tell you we will as we can. So you get notified for a grant that you've received one. That's great, and we'll move forward and get you out a grant agreement, and we'll get you your check for your grant payment, and then you will have a year to complete the project from when you receive the payment, and then another 30 days after that to submit a final report. And if you need an extension for some reason, just give us a call, send us the email, and we can talk about what's happening, and almost always we're able to grant the extension. But what happens if you didn't get a grant? So the most common reason why you didn't receive a grant is because our funding is limited. We do technically have nationwide coverage, but our grant funding comes from geographically restricted endowed funds, as I mentioned. So different locations have more competition. So in Kentucky, this is less of an issue because we do have a good amount of funding available in Kentucky, but it's still something where, we can't say deadline to deadline how many grant applications we're going to get. And sometimes we get a lot and we just don't have enough money to grant everybody. They might be perfectly fine projects, but we just don't have enough enough money. You may not have received a grant because you didn't have matching funds or you didn't have enough matching funds, and this sometimes becomes an issue more with getting a smaller grant than you requested. So maybe you're requesting $10,000, but you only have a match for $5,000. We can't give you the whole $10,000 grant. And this doesn't mean that, and this is, I'm saying like on your budget it shows that you only have $5,000. It's not that you are still looking for $5,000, it's just not showing up at all. Because as I said earlier, you don't have to have the match in hand when you apply. You just have to kind of know where you're going to get it from or have a good idea of that. Another reason why you may not have a grant, you may not have received a grant, is that it didn't meet our guidelines or you don't have enough eligible expenses. So our minimum grant is for $2,500. We don't generally give grants smaller than that. But that means you have to have a project that has enough eligible expenses to meet that minimum amount. So for example, you have to have enough eligible expenses in your grant application that both our grant and the match to our grant would cover. So for example, if you have a $10,000 project and you're asking for a $5,000 grant and you have $5,000 in matching funds from a local foundation, that's great. You have the one-to-one match needed, so that's perfect. But let's say that $5,000 of your project is to hire an architect to create drawings for you, and $5,000 is for a contractor to do work for your building. Depending on what your project is, that might not work. In that case, if you were applying for one of our the Favreau Fund or the Mitchell Fund, you would only be eligible for a $2,500 grant because only $5,000 of your expenses are eligible. This is less of an issue. This specific example, less of an issue with the Bruckheimer Fund, since that does allow for physical preservation work, but it is one of the largest issues we see in our funds, is just not having enough of eligible expenses on the grant. And then finally, it may just be that the project isn't the right fit for us. So if it's not preservation focused, and we see this more in educational programs, if it just seems more general history but not really tied to the building or the space, the site, it just may not be something we are willing to fund. And if it's not the right fit for you, so let's say you're working on an educational project but your roof is about to cave in, and we can see that from the picture, we're going to have some questions as to why you're choosing to apply for that type of grant instead of working on sort of a more immediate physical need for your building. So the way you can kind of try to get around some of these is to reach out to us before you apply. We can talk through your project with you to see if it makes sense for our fund, for any of our funds. If you're not sure what you should apply for, give us a call or an email just to start you and keep you from putting time into an application that's not going to be a super viable one. And sometimes the timing is off, or we've just spent all of our funding for the year. So you might consider applying again later in the year. This is something that comes up a lot in the spring. Our February grant round is our last grant round of our fiscal year. So by then, sometimes we have less money left than we do when we start off in June, and the next June, the next kind of cycle. So we may think your project is great and we just don't have funding left that year to fund it. So we may just ask you, you know what, just come back in the next grant round and we will take another look at it and consider it again. And we also sometimes ask you to consider a special fund, one of those funds I talked about, Favreau or Mitchell or Hart. And we may recommend this to you, or you may want to consider it for yourselves, depending on the timing of your program, that might actually work better than the Kentucky fund. And like I said, Kentucky's, you all are lucky in Kentucky because you do have this ability to apply for brick and mortar funding. It's something that we would love to be able to do nationally, and we just, because of the way that our grants were set up, is not an opportunity we have in all of the states. So we are really pleased that that's something that we can do in Kentucky, and hope that that's really helpful to all of you. So next, I just have some time for questions, and you can go ahead and type those in to the questions box, and I see I have one. Does the Bruckheimer Fund require organizations to be nonprofit government? Yes, it does. This is something that's overall all of our entire grant program. Organizations need to be either nonprofit organizations or government agencies. I don't think I see any more questions. We can take a second. I mean, I guess that's good if I've answered all of your questions before you've been able to ask them. But if you do have questions after this,
Diana, I think we have somebody that might want to, that's raising their hand.
okay.
So I'm going to click on her audio and see if we can pull her in for a question. And maybe some folks aren't familiar with how to use the question panel. Sue Lynn McDaniel, I think you have a question. Your hand is raised in the control panel. Sue Lynn McDaniel? Nope. Okay.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you all. I'm going to close out here and make some final comments.
Yeah, and if folks have questions that come up, I'm happy. Jordan's actually on vacation this week, so if you called or emailed, you would get me in the next couple of days. We're always happy to answer questions. We're here, 9 to 5 Eastern, and we're happy to talk through stuff.
And if you do, exactly, and if you do have any questions, feel free to call or email Diana or me or Jordan. And we had 42 people join us today. I'm really pleased to have such a great turnout response. If you aren't signed up for our e-news, you can do so on our website to receive information and about upcoming webinars and events and timely historic preservation information. And I wanted to mention our next webinar is next Thursday, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's Why We Preserve. Daniel Vivian, PhD, Professor of Public History in the Department of History at the University of Louisville, and also a former board member of Preservation Kentucky, will be presenting this webinar. And I think, for those of us in the business, we understand historic preservation and we know the arguments, but sometimes when we're trying to articulate this to folks who don't subscribe to historic preservation or don't understand it and why they want to say that old building, I think it's always helpful to hear some fresh approaches to how to make a compelling case for support and closing argument, so to speak. So I hope you can join us for that webinar. And we have others coming up, as I've mentioned, throughout the month. Next Wednesday in Louisville, Dr. David Ames, will be presenting on Louisville's architecture at the St. Matthew's Library from 6 to 7, and that information's on our website as well. Thank you, Diana, for taking the time to present today, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, this webinar has been recorded and will be available to you to review later for more reference. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.